Okay, so the shirim today are dedicated for a refuah shlema. A refuah shlema for a woman who needs a refuah shlema. Her name is Sarah Bat Golda. Sarah Bat Golda. Sarah Bat Golda. She is the mother of an alumna of Midrash Rachel, and so the shirim today are dedicated for a refuah shlema for Sarah Bas Golda. Okay, so a few weeks ago, the remains of Ron Gavili, Hashem Yikom Damo, were brought back from Gaza. This marked what could be called the end of a war that erupted on Simchat Torah over 2 years ago. Coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, it was the week of Parshat Bishalach, the parsha that documents the exodus of Am Yisrael from Egypt, including the taking by Moshe Rabbeinu of Yosef HaTzadik's bones with him for burial in Eretz Yisrael. The attack on October 7th and the ensuing war brought to the fore, amongst other things, the role of leadership. Why were we caught off guard? Where was the leadership, both political and military? The answers to these questions have yet to be fully addressed. Throughout the history of the Jewish people, leadership and its role in how our history has played out is a major topic. Purim is no exception, and that is what I hope to examine more in depth today. The first leader for Am Yisrael was, of course, Moshe Rabbeinu, if only because before that, there was no Am Yisrael. Unlike our elected officials, who often present themselves as the only ones who are capable of leading Am Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu had the opposite attitude. We are familiar with the story that Hashem appears to Moshe Rabbeinu in the desert around Minyan, far from any polling stations, and commanded him to take the mantle of leadership and demand Paro let Am Yisrael go and serve Hashem. The ensuing conversation between Hashem and Moshe Rabbeinu becomes a paradigm as to how one tries not to become a leader. As Moshe Rabbeinu says, Mi anochi ki elecha Paro v'chi otzi b'nei Yisrael miMitzrayim. Who am I to appear before Pharaoh, or to be the one to take Am Yisrael out of Egypt? Time and time again, Hashem tries to cajole and convince Moshe Rabbeinu that he is worthy of the role. And time again, Moshe Rabbeinu deflects attention away from himself. And he does all this without spending one shekel of public money. Finally, Hashem allows one concession to Moshe Rabbeinu, letting Aaron, his brother, be the spokesman to Pharaoh. But like it or not, the reluctant Moshe Rabbeinu becomes the Jewish leader. Then, once appointed the Jewish leader, Moshe Rabbeinu, rather than basking in his glory and taking expensive trips on his private jet, Moshe Rabbeinu works tirelessly on behalf of Am Yisrael. As it says in Parshat Yitro, Vayamod ha'am al Moshe min haboker ad arev. Am Yisrael stood in line in order to receive direction and judgment from Moshe Rabbeinu from the morning until the night. In other words, this was no 9-to-5 job. Moshe Rabbeinu totally dedicated himself to the needs of Am Yisrael until his father-in-law Yitro came along and said, you need to delegate and share some of this burden. Nor did Moshe Rabbeinu have an easy time being the Jewish leader. Time after time he was tested by Am Yisrael as he weathered continual complaints from Am Yisrael as detailed by the Torah. It was even an attempted coup by Korach and his group. And in the end, after all this dedication and Mesirut Nefesh on behalf of Am Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu did not get to enter Eretz Yisrael because of the sin at Mei Merivah. Such is the making of a true Jewish leader. Reluctance for the role in the first place, total dedication to the task, and no guarantee for a happy ending. Now let's fast forward some 1,000 years to the time of Purim. A young Jewish woman by the name of Esther, quietly living her life in the service of Hashem, is forcibly taken to the palace of the king of Persia, who, like Pharaoh in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, was the most powerful ruler in the world, ruling over 127 countries, from India to Ethiopia. As Hashem would have it, she becomes the reigning queen over this vast empire. I doubt this was the dream of a good Jewish girl. She was living in luxury, but for her, she was trapped in a gilded cage. Nor she was allowed to stay there in a sedentary role. As the conflict between Mordechai and Haman unfolds, and Haman hatches his evil plot, Mordechai turned to Esther as the person who could be the one to appear before the Pharaoh of those times, i.e. King Ahasuerus, and have him let her people go, i.e. have the horrible decree against them annulled. As by Moshe Rabbeinu, Queen Esther is reluctant to appear before the king. She protests to Mordechai, Kol ish v'isha, asher yavo el hamelech el chatzar pnimit, asher lo yikareh, achat dato lahamit. Anyone who comes to the inner courtyard and appears before the king without being summoned by the king could well be executed. Mordechai responds that Esther must accept this mantle of leadership, no matter what the price. His words are amongst the most well-known in the Megillah. Al tidami benafshech, kim hacharesh tacharishi bait hazot, reva chatzala yamod layudim mimakom acher. Mordechai tells Esther a harsh reality of leadership. Your personal safety is of little consequence when there arises a need to act on behalf of the Jewish people. He adds, if you do not act, salvation for the Jewish people will come from makom acher, from another place. These words of Mordechai galvanize the young queen into action, and indeed this is the beginning of the process that leads to the salvation of the Jewish people on Purim. Well, all's well as well, right? Well, not quite. The Jewish people indeed were saved from their terrible fate. But what about Esther herself? Like Moshe Rabbeinu, she was never able to return to the promised land, of living a life, a Torah life, amongst her people. She remained a prisoner in the Persian palace. Hence, there can be similarities made between the life of Moshe Rabbeinu as the leader of Am Yisrael and that life of Esther Hamalka. Interestingly, Moshe Rabbeinu started off his life in a palace and yet ended up amongst the people. Esther Hamalka started amongst the people and ended up in a palace. Is there significance to this? More on this later. The lives and rules of Moshe Rabbeinu and Esther Hamalka may even intersect on a deeper level, may be more than just sharing the travails of a Jewish leader. The Megillah tells us that in order to decide when to have the Jews wiped out, Haman cast lots. As it says, he peeled pur hu hagorah. The result of that casting of lots came out on the 13th of Adar. On the above quote, the Gemara Masechet Megillah says, Tana, Kevan shenafal pur b'chodesh Adar, once the lottery came out on Adar, samach simcha gdola. Says the Tanaic source by the Gemara, when Haman saw that the casting of the lots came out in the month of Adar, he was very joyous. Amar, nafal li pur b'yerach shemet bo Moshe. Haman said, the lottery has come out in the month that Moshe Rabbeinu died. Haman viewed this as an omen that this was a month of bad luck for the Jewish people, and hence a propitious time to carry out his evil plan. However, the continues, Lo haya yodea, but Haman did not know, Shiva Adar mate, B'Shiva Adar nolad. Okay? Haman, while being correct that Moshe Rabbeinu died on the 7th of Adar, was not aware that Moshe Rabbeinu was also born on the 7th of Adar. The point of the Gemara seems to be, given that Moshe Rabbeinu was also born on Adar, Adar is actually a good month for the fortunes of the Jewish people. Rav Moshe Shapira, Zecher Tzadik Libracha, asked a question on the above Gemara. Lichora, it would seem that Haman Rasha, Yimach Shemo, was more correct than the Tan of our Gemara. That is, the day of death, in general, is more significant than the day of birth. I add my own embellishment. We often recognize the yahrzeit, the anniversary of the death of great tzaddikim. First of Av for Aaron HaKohen, 20th of Iyar for Shmuel Navi. Rabbi Silverberg just recently talked about the 25th of Shvat for Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, etc. Does anybody know the days that those people were born? My father, Ova Shalom, davened as a youth in a shul called the Chevra Shas. He told me that they never said Tachnu. Why? Because there's an old yid there who knew the yahrzeit of every tzaddik and every rebbe. Right before they're about to say Tachnu, he'd give a clap on the table and announce, today's the yahrzeit of the blah, 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 Rebbe, and they would skip Tachnu. So it seems the day of death is more significant than the day of birth. So what's the pshat in the Gemara? Moshe Shapiro answers this question with an amazing insight that unveils the miracle of Purim in a new light. To better appreciate what he says, we first need to access a very well-known Gemara that relates to Purim, in Masechet Shabbat, Daf Pechet Amud Aleph. You'll probably hear about it today a few times. In Sefer Shmot, Perek Tet Vav, Pasuk Tet Zayin, the Torah describes Am Yisrael surrounding Har Sinai for the purpose of receiving the Torah. The Torah says, Yatzvu b'tachti tahar, where the simple pshat is, they assembled at the foot of the mountain. But literal means they were assembled under the mountain. Given this literal meaning, the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat says, Amar Avidimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa, Melamei shekafar alem hahar kigigit. This teaches us that Hashem actually took the mountain and put it over Am Yisrael, holding it over them like a barrel. Gemara continues, Amar Lahem, Hashem said to Am Yisrael, Im atem mikablim et Torah, tov, mutav, great, v'im lav, sham teikvu etchem. Kadosh Baruch Hu, holding the mountain over them, said, if you accept the Torah, great, all is well, but if not, this will be your burial place. Okay? In other words, Hashem told Am Yisrael, accept my Torah or die. Okay? Now this Gemara should raise our hackles. If you don't know what hackles are, you can look it up later. Okay? Less than 2 weeks ago, we read in Parshat Mishpatim, when Am Yisrael were offered the Torah, their response was the famous, Naseh v'nishma. Naseh v'nishma. I.e., if we accept the Torah of Hashem, we accept the Torah of Hashem even before we understand it. Indeed, on the very same page of Gemara, on Shabbat, Pechet Amud Aleph, a few lines down it says, when Am Yisrael said, Naseh v'nishma, 600,000 angels came down from heaven and tied 2 crowns to each person in Am Yisrael. In other words, it was viewed as one of Am Yisrael's finest moments in history. So how does this story align with the Gemara we just brought about Am Yisrael being forced to accept the Torah? Clearly, much ink has been spilled on answering the above question. One well-known answer is, Am Yisrael accepted fully the Torah shebichtav, the written Torah, okay, and did so by saying Naseh v'shma. However, when it comes to the Torah Shebal Peh, you know those rabbis, okay, they hesitated accepting the oral Torah, and to accept that, let us say, they needed a little bit extra of motivation. Going with this explanation, let's continue with the Gemara we quoted in Shabbat. Amar Rava afal pichei, even though they were coerced to accept Torah Shebal Peh at Sinai, Hadur kiblu ha-bimeach eshri rosh, dichtiv kimu v'kiblu ha-yudim, kimu masha kiblu kvar. Said Rava, Am Yisrael accepted the Torah Shebal Peh on their own volition in the days of Purim. As it says in Megillah, Kimu v'kiblu Yudim. The Jewish people voluntarily took on Torah Shebal Peh, even though they were coerced into accepting it at Sinai. Based on this interpretation after being saved on Purim, Am Yisrael accepted willingly to adhere to the oral Torah. The oral Torah that had been forced at Sinai, but they accepted it willingly on Purim. Let's take this idea and return to the question of Moshe Shapira. So what if Moshe is born in Adar? Why is that significant? Said Moshe Shapira, let's remember the historical significance of the time period that Purim takes place. This was known as a time of Hester Panim. That is a time when Hashem was hiding his face from Am Yisrael. What does that mean? In other words, the time of prophecy, which had been the general time from Matan Torah till that time, had come to an end, right before the time of Purim. The time of prophecy was a time of top-down Judaism, meaning a prophet received the word of Hashem from the heavens and transmitted to the will of Hashem to Am Yisrael. There was no machloket. The words of Hashem to the prophet were clear-cut, and not subject for dispute. But once there was no prophecy, who and what would leave the Jewish people? The answer is the Rabbanim. First, as the Anshe Knesset Gdolah, followed by the era of the Tanaim. It was now up to Chazal, the Rabbanim, to fill the void left by the absence of prophecy and guide the Jewish people. By drushing the Torah, deriving halacha, that is, under the leadership of Chazal, the Jewish people were guided as how they should serve Hashem in this new era. The transition referred to no less than the development of the Torah Shebal Peh. Now, this Purim was not just a miraculous event where Am Yisrael was saved from annihilation, although that's no small thing. But in addition, it was also a sea change for the Jewish people. Our whole system of governance changed from being led from heaven via prophecy to being led by Chazal. Hence, the acceptance of Torah Sheba'al Peh by Yisrael, as described in the Megillah and explained by the Gemara on Shabbat, was not just some random event where Am Yisrael felt good about being saved and therefore accepted Torah Sheba'al Peh. Rather, this voluntary acceptance of Torah Sheba'al Peh was recognition by Am Yisrael that from this moment, the baton of leadership had passed from the prophets to Chazal. If we go back now to the question asked by Rav Moshe Shapiro, how does the birth of Moshe Rabbeinu usurp or override the death of Moshe Rabbeinu, such that Adar is now a good month for the Jewish people? Moshe Shapiro answers as follows. The old system of leadership through prophecy started with Moshe Rabbeinu, who is known as Rosh HaNevi'im, the first and foremost of the Nevi'im, of the prophets. The system of leadership through prophecy that prevailed for close to 1,000 years after Moshe Rabbeinu can be viewed as the continuation of that system that was initiated by Moshe Rabbeinu. The end of that era can therefore be viewed as the death of Moshe Rabbeinu, the death of the system that he inaugurated. So Haman was ecstatic. Moshe Rabbeinu had died in Adar, and the system of leadership Moshe Rabbeinu had reduced had also died, and the Jewish people were leaderless and defenseless. Says the Gemara, you are wrong, evil Haman. For with the death of the system of prophecy came the birth of another system, inaugurated by no less than Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, what system is that? Moshe Rabbeinu was also the first link in the chain of giving over Torah Sheba'al Peh, which had taken a back seat to prophecy until now, but is now being born and is now on the ascent. I add my own words to this. I noted that before, Moshe Rabbeinu had started in a palace and ended up amongst the people. Esther HaMalka had started amongst the people and ended up in a palace. One can view this difference as being symbolic of the two systems we spoke about. The system, Moshe Rabbeinu, the one of prophecy, was one where the records come from heaven, from Hashem's palace, to the people via prophecy. The new system, which came prominently to the fore in the time of Esther HaMalka, starts with the people, as represented by Chazal. Chazal learn and teach the halacha, and which how we know how to serve Hashem, and that process starts with the people and then goes up to Shemayim, to the palace of Hashem. I wish to view this idea that the miracle of Purim highlight a transition from a prophecy-based system to a Chazal-based system from another angle. Let us analyze a critical moment in the process of salvation from Haman that was mentioned previously. We mentioned before that Esther HaMalka was reluctant to appear before Achashverosh. Then the words of Mordechai somehow galvanized her to take on this mission. What was the source of her initial hesitation? And what was it that Mordechai said that caused her to change her mind? The simple pshat is, she hesitated because of the threat of her own life. And she changed her mind. Only Mordechai told her, look, if you don't go, you and your father's house will be lost. But it's difficult to say that Esther HaMalka, raised in Mordechai's house, would put her own needs and her own survival above the welfare of the Jewish people. Hence, we need to examine the exchange between Mordechai and Esther more closely. Let us remind ourselves of the words of Mordechai at this critical juncture. Al tidami benafshech, kim hacharesh tacharishi be'et hazot, reva chadsala yamod layudim mimakom acher. Again, Mordechai tells Esther, do not be concerned with your own life, for if you remain silent, salvation for the Jewish people shall come mimakom acher, from a different place. So one could ask, how did Mordechai know that? How do you know that? Secondly, where is this makom acher, different place that Mordechai is talking about? Let us suggest as follows. Esther Malka was old school, still used to a Judaism that was led by prophecy. Esther, who grew up in Mordechai's house, knew that Mordechai was not a prophet. If so, what authority did he have to send her to the king? Without prophecy to back this up, this was a suicide mission, which is not a Jewish thing. Comes Mordechai and informs Esther that the time of leadership via prophecy was over. The mantle of leadership was now coming mimakom acher, from a different place. This was a place of leadership by Chazal, from a place of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Esther did know that Mordechai was a member of Anshe Knesset Hadolah. His message to her was, times have changed. I do have the authority and has the responsibility to guide you in order to save Am Yisrael. The harshness of his words was only to convince her of his conviction that this was a new path forward for Am Yisrael. Once Esther heard and understood this, she accepted this idea, and there was no longer hesitation on her part. Hence, Purim is the seminal event that marks the transition for the Jewish people, guided by prophecy to a Jewish people led by Chazal. One of the outcomes of this new system is that anyone who dedicates himself to learning Torah, especially Torah Shapell Peh, is not only gaining wisdom and growth that accompanies such learning, but is also undergoing leadership training, which means all of you, by deciding to come and learn yeshiva, are not only gaining Torah knowledge, but are also in potential training to become future leaders of Am Yisrael. This does not mean that you specifically are destined to be the leader of Am Yisrael, although you never know. So, leadership takes many forms, many levels, whether in your community or in some capacity. I want to return now to the theme which I started. The real Jewish leaders are not the ones pushing themselves to the fore. Usually they find themselves in a certain situation where Klal Yisrael needs them, and they need to reluctantly step up to the plate. They need to dedicate themselves selflessly to Am Yisrael and not expect any great reward or recognition in return. When it comes to Purim, this role fell upon a Jewish woman named Esther. She rose to the challenge, and all Am Yisrael benefited. Perhaps with this recognition, an answer could be provided to the following question. The fast we undergo next Monday on the 13th of Adar is called Tanit Esther. The question is, why is it called Tanit Esther? The fast we undergo on that day is explained by Mishnah Berurah, Orach Chaim Siman 686, corresponds to the fasting that the Jewish people are undergoing on that very day, because that was the day of battle. And the day of battle, the minhag of Am Yisrael, was to fast. And to recognize that, we also fast. So why is it called Tanit Esther? What does Esther have to do with that? Now it's true, Esther Malka did undergo a fast before appearing before Achashverosh, as documented in the Megillah itself in Perek Dalet, Pasuk Tet Zayin. Here are her famous words: Sumu alai, val tachlu val tishtu shlosha yamim, laila v'yom, gam ani v'narotai atzum kein. Am Yisrael should fast for my sake, do not eat for 3 days, night and day, and I and my maidservants shall also thusly fast. However, the fast that Esther undertook took place in Chodesh Nisan, some 11 months earlier. And if you say, okay, they have to call the fast of 13th of Adar something, and Esther Malka did play a prominent role in the Purim process, to which I respond, okay, so call it Tanit Mordechai. Or, for those who are more PC, Tanit Mordechai Esther. Perhaps the Tanit is called Tanit Esther in recognition that the victory of Am Yisrael on that day, on the 13th of Adar, started 11 months earlier. It started when Esther Malka accepted that the new leaders of the Jewish people were Chazal, as embodied at that moment by Mordechai. She accepted that from here on in, the leadership of the Jewish people was coming from Makom Acher, a different place. And based on that acceptance, she was willing to put her life on the line for Am Yisrael. Yeh Ratzon, may Hashem send us, in these times, these troubled times, worthy leaders to guide our way, and for good things. Purim Sameach.